Hello, this is Rabbi Dr. Juan Marcos Rojano Gutierrez, and we're continuing our series on Jewish perspectives on life after death. And yesterday we began a different section in the course because we started to look at the issue of necromancy or necromancia. And up until that point, we had been looking at the concept of Sheol. And so now we're turning our attention to a different aspect, the issue of mediums and communicating with the dead, which was a key feature of Canaanite religion. And in Isaiah chapter 8, verse 19, we find a reference to that. So we want to look at that very quickly. And it says, V'chi yomeru alechem, dirshu el ha'ovot ve'el hayidonim, hamatzaf tzifim v'hamagim, halo am el Elohav yidrosh ba'ad hachayim el hametim. Now, should people say to you, inquire of the ghost and familiar spirits that chirp and moan, for people may inquire of its divine beings of the dead on behalf of the living. Now, of course, the text itself is not promoting this view. It's stating that this is what people in this land were doing, in the land of Israel, unfortunately, because of the issue of syncretism, because of the issue of people combining Canaanite religious practices with those that were prescribed in the Torah. Now, my concern here is not so much the polemic against that, because it's clear that the Torah is against necromancy and sorcery and etc. But it's really just to understand that this is an issue that people were familiar with. Now, what's interesting is that the exact state of the dead remains unknown, so we don't really have an elaboration on that. And of course, if you remember the passages that we've looked at in the past regarding Sheol, give somewhat contradictory perspectives on the status of the dead. For the most part, we would say that they're in agreement. The dead sleep, the dead don't think, the dead don't remember. But a few passages implied that there is, some acknowledgement, some awareness of individuals that are coming into Sheol. So the wicked come into Sheol, and the other people, the people who have passed on, somehow know that this is happening. And in one other passage that we looked at, we talked about the Rephaim, the shades, stirring to meet you. So there's almost this implication that there's some kind of emotion, some type of a movement that takes place, that something can stir those who have passed on. So obviously, as I mentioned, necromancy is explicitly condemned as a pagan practice in the subsequent verses that follow. I didn't want to put those on there, but you can certainly look at that passage in its entirety. And the passage is evident in its assertion of the ability of the dead to be accessed or engaged. At least that's what I would argue. Because oftentimes the Torah and the rest of the Tanakh do not explicitly, deny the efficacy of a particular forbidden practice. They simply say it's not acceptable, right? It's not something that is permitted to the people of Israel, to the Jewish people, according to Torah law. It's not a rejection of the reality of this practice. Now, some people may find that problematic, but I think on a surface level, we could certainly argue that to be the case. And I know if we look at the Rambam and so forth, he would argue that this is basically just a consequence of trickery, which that may be. We can certainly look at someone like the Ramban, Moshe ben Nachman, who was a great believer in the reality of necromancy, to the extent that he actually visited someone who was a medium to ask them questions about their interaction with spirits, because he believed that this was an aspect of proving the existence of God. So I'm not encouraging that either, but you have sort of two different perspectives on this throughout Jewish history, although for the most part I would say that it's clear that the existence of Shadim, the existence of spirits and so forth, has certainly been accepted throughout most of Jewish tradition, certainly in the Bavli Babylonian Talmud, and obviously through the medieval period. But in any case, the issue here is simply to look at the biblical text and let it stand on its own as we continue on our discussion with the issue of necromancy.